It was one of those nights that felt heavier than usual. The kind of night where the darkness seemed thicker, and even the air had a weight to it. Ryan, Megan, and Ethan stood at the edge of the old park, staring at the forgotten playground. The rusty swings swayed lazily in the cool breeze, making soft, eerie creaks that echoed in the empty park. Ryan was the first to step forward. "Come on, let's see what's out there," he said with a grin that Megan couldn't quite place. It felt wrong. Why are we even doing this? Megan muttered under her breath, hugging herself against the chill in the air. "This place is creepy." Ethan shrugged. "Ryan's bored. Let's just get this over with." Ryan was the first to step forward. "Come on, let's see what's out there," he said with a grin that Megan couldn't quite place. It felt wrong. Why are we even doing this? Megan muttered under her breath, hugging herself against the chill in the air. "This place is creepy." Ethan shrugged. "Ryan's bored. Let's just get this over with." They wandered past the faded jungle gym, its colors long dulled by time. As they reached the far corner of the park, where weeds grew taller than the fences, Ryan's foot struck something solid beneath the dirt. He crouched down, brushing away the earth with an almost obsessive eagerness. "What the hell is this?" Ryan muttered, revealing the edge of a wooden box, half rotted and cracked. His fingers dug into the soil, yanking the box free with a snap. "Ryan, don't open it," Megan warned, a knot tightening in her chest. She didn't know why, but every part of her screamed that they shouldn't touch it. Ryan ignored her, prying the lid off with ease. Inside, amidst the remnants of dusty, forgotten toys, was a ring. Simple, dull silver, but something about it seemed alive. It caught the light just right, glimmering in a way that felt unnatural. Megan's heart thudded in her chest. "Ryan, don't." But Ryan, as always, didn't listen. He slipped the ring onto his finger with a smirk. As soon as it touched his skin, his face flickered, just for a second, into something that wasn't him. Megan blinked, but it was gone, leaving only that smirk behind. "We should go," she said, her voice shaky. "This isn't right." "Take it off, Ryan." Ryan glanced at the ring, then shrugged. "Why? It's just a ring." "You're being weird." The next day, Megan couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her gut. Ryan was different. He hadn't spoken much after putting on the ring, and now, at school, he was barely recognizable. He walked with a swagger that wasn't his eyes cold, almost empty. "Did you see what he did?" Ethan whispered to her during lunch, leaning in close. "He broke into Old Man Harris's shop last night. Just shattered the windows and walked off like it was nothing." Megan's heart sank. "What? Why?" Ethan shook his head. "I don't know. He's not right, Meg." That evening, she confronted Ryan. "What's going on with you? You've been acting weird ever since you put on that ring. This isn't like you." Ryan just smiled, but it wasn't his usual carefree grin. It was cold, sharp, almost predatory. "Maybe I'm tired of being like me." Megan felt a wave of nausea. "Take it off." "Make me," he said, his voice low and threatening. It wasn't a challenge. It was a warning. Days turned into weeks, and things got worse. Ryan wasn't just vandalizing the town anymore. He was doing things that made Megan's skin crawl. She'd heard whispers about the missing pets, the strange symbols carved into the side of houses, the feeling that something was watching you at night. Megan couldn't take it anymore. She went to Ryan's house, desperate to help him. "Please, Ryan, just take off the ring," she begged, her voice cracking with fear and frustration. "It's doing something to you." Ryan stood in the doorway, his face twisted with that unnatural smile. "You don't get it, Megan. I don't want to take it off." "Ryan, this isn't you. You're better than this," she shouted, her heart pounding. She grabbed his hand, trying to pull the ring off herself, but as soon as her fingers touched the cold metal, Ryan's expression changed. His eyes darkened, and his grip tightened around her wrist, squeezing painfully. "Let go," he growled, his voice barely recognizable. Megan jerked back, tears filling her eyes. "You have to stop. This thing is destroying you." Ryan just laughed, a sound so hollow it made her shudder. "It's too late for that." That night, Megan couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with images of Ryan, the ring, and the darkness that had consumed him. She had to do something. She couldn't let it end like this. She called Ethan, her voice trembling. "We need to get that ring off him. Tonight." Ethan didn't hesitate. "I'll meet you there." They arrived at Ryan's house after midnight, the air cold and still. The front door was unlocked, as if he had been expecting them. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. They found Ryan in his room, sitting on the bed, staring at the ring. "I tried to take it off," he said, his voice flat. "It won't come off." Megan's blood ran cold. She stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached out for the ring. But the moment her fingers brushed against it, she felt an icy, crawling sensation that shot up her arm, freezing her in place. Ryan's eyes flicked toward her, but they weren't his eyes anymore. They were black, empty voids. "It's not coming off, Megan. I'm never taking it off." Before she could react, Ryan lunged at her, knocking her back. Ethan grabbed him, trying to pull him away, but Ryan was unnaturally strong, his hands cold as death. In the struggle, Ethan managed to pry the ring off Ryan's finger, but instead of relief, there was only horror. Ryan collapsed, his body limp and lifeless. His eyes, once cold and dark, were now wide with fear, staring up at the ceiling in terror. The ring lay on the floor between them, its dull silver surface now pulsing with a sickly glow. Megan's breath caught in her throat. The ring wasn't done. It wanted more. "Ethan, bury it. Bury it now," she gasped, her voice shaking with panic. Ethan grabbed the ring, his face pale with fear. "What about Ryan?" Megan stared at her fallen friend, tears streaming down her face. "He's gone." They buried the ring deep in the park, shoveling dirt over the cursed box as fast as they could. But even as the earth covered it, Megan could still feel it, that pull, that darkness, whispering to her ... As they stood over the freshly buried ground, Megan felt the weight of what they had done. It was over, but not really. The ring wasn't gone. It was just waiting. And somewhere in the silence of the night, she could still hear that faint, mocking laugh. The darkness had only begun. The park was eerily quiet that night. No breeze, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural stillness that pressed against their skin like the weight of a suffocating blanket. Julia, Luke, and Ava stood at the entrance of the park, their flashlights flickering nervously in the darkness. The darkness had only begun. "I don't like this," Ava whispered, her voice trembling. She shifted uneasily, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "It feels wrong." The darkness had only begun. Julia's pulse quickened, though she tried to hide it. "It's just the park, Ava. You're freaking yourself out." Luke, always the skeptic, scoffed. "You guys really believe all that Whispering Grove nonsense? It's just a local legend to keep kids from sneaking around at night." The darkness had only begun. But even Luke couldn't shake the unease that hung in the air. The legend of the Whispering Grove had been around for as long as any of them could remember stories of a secluded part of the park where people heard voices, whispers calling their name, and those who listened for too long, well, they never came back the same. The darkness had only begun. Still, Julia pressed forward, trying to ignore the tightness in her chest. She didn't believe in ghosts or curses. Yet, something about the park felt alive tonight, like it was waiting for them. "Come on," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. Let's just get this over with. As they ventured deeper into the park, the shadows seemed to thicken. The path they followed grew narrower, the trees closing in around them like watchful sentinels. Every step felt heavier, like the ground itself was trying to swallow them whole. "Do you hear that?" Ava's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes wide and panicked. Julia froze. At first, there was only silence, but then she heard it too, a faint, barely there murmur, as if the wind itself was speaking ... Luke snorted. "It's just the wind. Stop." The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just wind. It was words, soft and fragmented, but clear enough to make Julia's blood run cold. Julia, Ava, Luke. Their names carried on the breeze, as if someone or something was calling them from the trees. "Okay, screw this," Ava stammered, stepping back. "We need to leave." But as she turned to go, the path they had come from was gone. The trees had shifted, the way out completely obscured by thick, gnarled branches that hadn't been there before. Luke's flashlight flickered again, casting long, dancing shadows across the ground. What the hell is happening? Julia's heart raced, her palms sweaty as panic clawed at her chest. She tried to steady her breath, but the whispering was getting louder, closer. It was like the voices were right next to her, breathing down her neck. "Stay with us." Her stomach churned as a wave of nausea hit. She stumbled back, her flashlight shaking in her hands. We're not alone. Something's here. Ava's eyes filled with tears as she backed into Julia, her hands trembling uncontrollably. "What do we do? How do we get out?" Luke clenched his fists, trying to stay in control. But Julia could see it. He was scared, really scared. "We keep moving," he said, though his voice wavered. "There has to be a way out." They pressed on, deeper into the grove, though every step felt like they were walking in circles. The whispering never stopped, growing louder and more insistent with every second. Julia's thoughts were spinning. The voices sounded so familiar now, like they weren't just whispering to her. They were inside her mind, weaving themselves into her thoughts, coaxing her to listen, to follow. Suddenly, Ava cried out and fell to her knees, her hands clutching her head. "Make it stop. Please, make it stop." Julia knelt beside her, her own head pounding. "Ava, look at me. Don't listen to them." But Ava was already gone. Her eyes glazed over as she stared blankly into the trees. I hear them. They want us to stay. They want us to listen." Luke grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her hard. "Snap out of it. Ava, snap out of it." But Ava's voice was soft now, far away. "They want us to be with them. Forever." Before Julia could react, Ava stood up and started walking, slowly, toward the thickest part of the grove. Her movements were mechanical, as if she was being pulled by some invisible force. "Ava, no!" Julia screamed, grabbing for her, but Ava slipped from her grasp, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. Luke ran after her, but as he did, the whispering surged, and the trees seemed to shift again, creating a wall of branches between them and Ava. Julia's breath came in ragged gasps as the realization hit her. They couldn't stop it. Whatever had gotten inside Ava's head, it was too late. She's gone. The thought came unbidden, but she couldn't push it away. Ava was lost. "Luke," she whispered, her voice shaky. "We have to go, now." Luke stared at the trees, his fists clenched in frustration, but he nodded. "Yeah. Let's move." They tried to find their way out, but the park was no longer the same. The trees had shifted again, the paths twisted in impossible ways. Julia's panic rose with each wrong turn, the oppressive weight of the whispers dragging her down, making it harder to think, harder to breathe. Then, she felt a cold breath against her ear. "Stay. Stay with us." She whirled around, her flashlight sweeping the area, but there was no one there. The voices were everywhere, all around her, inside her head. "Luke!" she shouted, but her voice came out as a whisper. He didn't turn around. He was walking ahead, not looking back. "Luke?" She tried again, panic setting in. But when he finally did turn, her heart nearly stopped. It wasn't Luke ... It was his face, his body, but his eyes were wrong. They were empty, like two dark pits of nothing. And his smile. It was wide, too wide, stretching unnaturally across his face. Julia backed away, her flashlight flickering wildly in her trembling hand. You're not him." The thing that was wearing Luke's face tilted its head, the smile never faltering. "He's here, with us." She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. "Run!" her mind screamed, but her body wouldn't listen. The thing took a step closer, its movements jerky, unnatural. "Stay with us, Julia." The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and she felt herself slipping, her mind unraveling under the weight of them. She was losing herself, just like Ava, just like Luke. But in the last moment of clarity, Julia did the only thing she could think of. She closed her eyes and stopped listening. When she woke up, the sun was rising, casting the park in soft, golden light. The trees were just trees again. The paths were clear, but Luke and Ava were gone. Julia staggered to her feet, her body aching, her mind buzzing with fragments of the night before. She could still hear the whispers faintly, but they were fading, like echoes of a nightmare she couldn't quite shake. She stumbled out of the park, her legs weak, her hands shaking uncontrollably. But as she left the whispering grove behind, she felt it, the cold weight in her pocket. She pulled it out Ava's necklace, the one she had been wearing before she disappeared. Julia's breath caught in her throat, her heart racing, and then she heard it again, faint and far away, but unmistakable. "Come back." The park wasn't done with her yet. The sound of something snapping in the underbrush made Caleb freeze. He glanced over at his sister, Lily, who was already clutching his arm, her wide eyes reflecting the dim glow of the street lamp behind them. They had ventured too deep into the park, far beyond the playground and the familiar jogging paths, into the thick of the woods where nobody ever went after dark. "I don't like this," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. Caleb swallowed hard, trying to keep his cool. "It's fine. Just some animals or something." But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. The air here was different, dense, almost suffocating. The trees loomed taller, their branches twisting together like bony fingers. And there was a strange hum in the air, something that made his skin crawl. They'd come out here on a dare. The Hollow Trail, as the locals called it, was infamous. Stories about people going missing, or worse, being found in pieces, covered in some black, sticky substance, had circulated for years. But no one ever found out what was behind it. Now, standing in the oppressive darkness, Caleb was regretting ever accepting the challenge. He should have known better, but something in him, maybe pride, had forced him forward, forced them both forward. "We should go back," Lily urged, her voice barely above a whisper now. "Yeah, let's go," Caleb agreed, turning on his heel. But the path they'd come from, it was gone. He spun in place, trying to remember how they'd gotten here. Hadn't they come down this way? Or was it that way? "I don't remember this tree," Caleb muttered, his voice cracking slightly as panic began to gnaw at the edges of his thoughts. Lily grabbed his arm tighter, her nails digging into his skin. "Caleb, where's the path?" I don't know," he admitted, his heart hammering in his chest. A gust of cold wind blew through the trees, carrying with it a soft, almost melodic whisper. Lily flinched. "Did you hear that?" Caleb nodded, his mouth dry. He'd heard it too. But more than the whisper, it was what followed that made his blood turn to ice. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps just beyond the trees. "Run!" Caleb breathed, grabbing Lily's hand and yanking her forward. They sprinted through the dense forest, branches slashing at their arms and faces as they pushed deeper into the unknown. The footsteps followed, growing louder, faster, like something or someone was giving chase. Caleb's breath came in ragged gasps, his lungs burning with each step. He glanced over his shoulder, but the darkness was too thick, too impenetrable. Still, he could feel it. Whatever was out there was getting closer. They burst into a small clearing, both of them stumbling to a stop. In the center of the clearing stood an old, rusted gate, almost swallowed by the overgrown weeds and ivy that surrounded it. Beyond the gate, there was nothing but blackness and impenetrable void that seemed to swallow light itself. Lily was shaking, her eyes wide with terror. "What is that?" Caleb's legs felt like lead, his breath shallow and quick. I don't know." The whispers grew louder, echoing all around them now. The words were indistinguishable, but the tone was unmistakable. Something wanted them to come closer. Caleb stared at the gate, his heart pounding in his ears. "Maybe it's a way out," he said, though he didn't believe it. "Or maybe it's a trap," Lily countered, her voice sharp with fear. The footsteps stopped. The forest fell deathly silent, the only sound the rapid thudding of their hearts. "Caleb," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's watching us." Caleb felt a chill crawl up his spine. He didn't need to ask what she meant. He could feel it too, the weight of unseen eyes, boring into them from the shadows. Without thinking, Caleb reached for the gate. His hand trembled as he gripped a cold metal, rust flaking off in his palm. He pushed the gate open with a groan that seemed to echo for miles. Caleb, no. Lily began, but it was too late. They stepped through the gate. The second they crossed the threshold, everything changed. The oppressive darkness of the forest disappeared, replaced by an eerie, unnatural light. They stood in a vast, empty field that stretched on forever in all directions. The ground beneath their feet soft and spongy, like wet moss. But the air was wrong, heavy, too thick. Every breath felt like swallowing syrup. "What? Where are we?" Lily's voice was shaking, her eyes wide with confusion and terror. Caleb shook his head. He had no answers, only fear. A shadow passed over them, quick, silent, like a bird of prey. Caleb jerked his head upward, but saw nothing. The field was empty, save for the two of them. "We need to leave," Lily said, her voice firm but fragile. "Yeah," Caleb whispered. "But where do we go?" And then he heard it. A low, guttural growl rumbling up from the ground itself. Lily's hand tightened around his arm, her breathing coming faster. "Caleb, something's here." They both turned, and what they saw made their blood run cold. Figures, at least a dozen, stood at the edge of the field, barely visible in the dim light. Tall, twisted shapes, their limbs long and gangly, their faces obscured by shadow, but their eyes. Those eyes were clear, glowing, hollow orbs, locked onto Caleb and Lily with a hunger that made Caleb's stomach churn. Lily took a step back, her voice a shaky whisper. "What do we do?" Caleb's mind raced, his pulse hammering in his ears. The figures were moving now, slowly, methodically, closing the distance between them. "We need to run," he said, his voice barely steady. But as they turned to flee, they were met with an impossibility. There, standing just feet away, was Caleb. Not just a reflection or hallucination, but him. An exact copy, down to the last detail, staring back at him with dead, vacant eyes. Lily gasped, stepping back. Caleb! But it wasn't just him. Behind the copy of Caleb, there was a copy of Lily. And behind them, more figures emerged from the field duplicates, each one more grotesque and twisted than the last, their faces contorted into unnatural, wicked smiles. Caleb's heart thundered in his chest, his mind screaming at him to run, but his body was frozen. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The copies moved closer, their twisted smiles growing wider, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth. Caleb reached for Lily, but as his hand grasped hers, it wasn't her. He looked down, his breath catching in his throat. Her face was melting skin dripping like wax, eyes hollowing into black voids, her body bending and twisting into a grotesque mockery of itself. The last thing he heard before everything went black was the sound of his own voice, whispering softly in his ear. "You're not leaving. You're never leaving." When they found Caleb and Lily the next morning, they were standing at the entrance of the park, side by side. But something was off. Their eyes, hollow and blank, stared straight ahead, their faces twisted into eerie, unnatural smiles. No one ever knew what happened that night, but everyone who saw them said the same thing. They didn't come back the same. And somewhere deep in the woods, the gate remains, waiting.